Hi, this is Stu Stover again. We are starting the first session of economics. And so a couple things I wanted to get into with this first session. One is you might have noticed that I'm wearing a particular garb. And so some of you may know what this is. This is a Filipino barong Tagalog. The reason I'm wearing it, twofold. One is I spent 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer in the Philippines when the dictator Marcos was there. And so in some later session I may do something on the dangers of dictatorships and authoritarian kinds of systems. But I spent the time there and why that is connected to Econ is that Econ just isn't about American economics. Econ is about the world. And so we're going to spend a fair amount of time in this course, both micro, macro, spending time on looking at how the rest of the world handles some of these problems, and whether it's inflation or unemployment or economic growth or, pick an issue, we are going to be focused on more of a global approach in this course. So I wear this because it's important that we realize that we're expanding our boundaries a bit with this stuff. Now, the next piece I wanted to get to real quick is branches of economics. So what we've got in Econ right now is the branch called econometrics, which is the math and the charts and the all that more technical math-oriented kind of stuff has really come to dominate the field. And the answer is it's probably a little dangerous unless you happen to work at the Federal Reserve, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, or some other big organization where all of that data and that approach makes a fair amount of sense. Now, I'm also a little nervous because the predictive power of Econ is not always all that great, and there's an assumption in all of that econometrics can give us answers for the future. Well, and sometimes that's true. But there's other branches, and so the global side is kind of a branch. There's also the behavioral economics, which looks at how you and I make decisions, particularly financial decisions in our lives, and how we sort those kind of things out. There's also social economics, there's also inequality, and there's other variations that focus on Econ. And so what we're going to try and do in this course is cover a bit of all of it. Not so much the econometrics, but the other stuff. If you were going to get a job someday in Econ, then we would spend more time on the econometrics. But most of you aren't, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time there. So what we've got are the basic two branches. So one branch is micro. Micro tends to focus on you and I as individuals. How do we go about making decisions? How do we go about allocating resources? How do we handle the economic choices that we have? Am I going to buy this car? Am I going to buy that car? Am I going to buy a house? Am I going to rent? Am I going to, buy a new TV? The choices that we have are endless. And how do we make those choices? And another example of that is, are you going to buy the cheap ice cream or are you going to buy the expensive ice cream? Well, why would you make the decision for one or the other? And there's a lot of issues that we'll get into as we look at more of the behavioral side of economics in micro. But that's only one piece of micro. A second piece is how does the business community make decisions? The business community, it has to make decisions. They've got limited resources, and so they have to decide if they're going to spend their time, energy, resources over here or over there. And those choices will make a difference. So you look at, for example, an example like Blockbuster. Blockbuster was astonishingly powerful. They were ubiquitous. They were everywhere. And then they weren't. And so they made a decision, you and I as consumers, we're going to continue to go to a store to rent a video to bring home to watch on our TV. As streaming started to show up, could they have made the decision to switch over to streaming? Of course they could have. They had a ton of money. They had a ton of goodwill, a ton of branding, all sorts of stuff that they had, but they chose not to do it. They chose to stay with their videotapes and their CDs and whatever. And lots of other examples of that kind of stuff. I mean, we could go back to the old days of IBM and whatever, but the choices that business have are important to look at and examine how we do that stuff. The third piece of micro is we tend to look at the role of government and how government plays a role in broader society, not only with us as individuals, but with the business community. And so there's lots of issues that show up with government, particularly in micro. Micro is more focused on that. Macro, on the other hand, is big picture stuff. So this tends to be smaller picture, big picture. Big picture means we look at inflation, we look at unemployment, we look at economic growth, we look at the kinds of choices that societies have. Now we're going to spend a ton of time in macro looking at the kinds of choices that every society has, because obviously we want to be a growing society. We don't want to see GDP shrinking. We don't want to see inflation shoot up too much, because the consequences are pretty dire when inflation starts to shoot up. So macro tends to focus on those big picture questions, but it also tends to focus on how we do things like international trade. And so the notion of tariffs, which is, at least at the moment, a huge issue in American society, those kind of things are very much a part of how macroeconomics works. And we'll talk in great depth in macro on some of the international questions that are going to show up there. So what does that mean? Economics, you can kind of break it down into three basic ideas as a way to kind of start the course. One is scarcity. Now, scarcity is pretty simple. Do we have enough money for everything we want? Does the country have enough money for everything we want? Do businesses have enough money for everything they want? And the answer is, of course not. We are constrained by not only money, but time and energy, and you look at a lot of other things. And if you operate from the principle of scarcity, it requires us to make choices. You have to choose. And so how do you go about making that process of deciding whether to do this or that, or spend your money here, spend your time there? Those are all things that we will examine in this course, but scarcity is critical. Now, I have a son who is convinced that I'm absolutely wrong. Scarcity is not the way to go. It's not the way to think. We have to think in terms of abundance. And I went, really? And so how would that work if we thought in terms of abundance? Abundance meaning we always got more and it's never a problem, and you can always, well, the answer is those kind of decisions could be interesting to think about how that works. But Econ, every single textbook kind of starts the same place, that we have scarcity. Scarcity requires us to make choices. And that's not just personal. So it's not, do I spend more money on a car, which means I spend less money on food and entertainment, or I spend more money on entertainment and I spend less money on a car. All of those kind of personal things. But it's also local government, state government, federal government. It's also businesses. And so state government, well, let me use the example, local government. Happen to live in a little town, we got bad roads. Okay, so the dilemma is the city has limited resources that they can spend for parks and police and fire department and all the other stuff, and they're always balancing where they're going to spend their money. Well, it requires choices. Are we going to spend more money on roads? And if we spend more money on roads, what are we going to spend less money on? Now, state government, local government, they can't run deficits like the federal government can, so we are constrained more at the local level. And so then that gets us to the third question, or the third issue that shows up in every first chapter of every econ book, which is opportunity cost. So when we look at opportunity costs is something we're going to deal with more so in micro than in macro, but still, we're going to spend time on opportunity costs throughout the course. And so opportunity costs is simply, you've got your best choice, and then you've got your second best choice. And what's the difference? What are you going to gain? What are you going to lose if you choose this versus that? And we'll do lots of examples of how that works, because the business community does it, obviously national governments do it at certain levels. And next time we talk about production possibility curve, we'll look at that more at a national level. We're also going to be looking at next time probably market failures. But before we finish this first session, one of the things that is important to understand about econ is that econ is about complexity. It is not about simple choices. And what that means is that there are short-run consequences to any decision we make. So what happens tomorrow? What happens this afternoon as we make this decision? Short run. Typically in the business community, we talk about short run as anything that happens in less than 6 months. Government, probably much the same too, short-run consequences. But then you got long-run consequences. And long-run consequences mean that if we're not thinking about what happens down the road if we make this decision, and there's a million examples that we will get into on how that works, but right now in America, we seem to not want to deal with this side of the equation. We just want to make decisions. And then if there's negative consequences, or in this case what we would call unintended consequences, then we deal with them at that time. And I think that's kind of a bad way to go. We ought to be thinking more systemically to think about how we can actually make better decisions, not just in the moment, but for the long haul. And there's lots of examples of that. So for what it's worth, econ is important. Astonishingly important at so many levels. And it doesn't matter if we're looking at micro or macro, the consequences are there, and we need to understand how the system works. We need to understand why this matters. And let me give you one last little quote. Okay, I don't know if this is a real story or not, it doesn't matter. President Truman walked out of a meeting one time, and he said, I got to get a bunch of one-armed economists. And his advisors who were walking with him said, what are you talking? You want one-armed economists? And he says, yeah, because every time we talk about something, the economist will say, on one hand, and then on the other hand. And so he wanted more simplistic answers to complex problems. Well, I would argue in today's world, there's a lot of people that want more simplistic answers to problems. And the reality of econ is that we got to look at a more complex kind of system. So we will pick up the details of all this stuff in the next video. Thank you very much.